I'm going to begin this section with a little bit of conceptual and historical framing as we think about what it means to teach writing to multilingual learners. And I want to begin by talking about one of my favorite TV shows, the Great British Baking Show. Now, if you haven't seen this amazing show, first of all, you should go watch it. But in case you haven't, I will provide a little bit of context about what happens in the show. In the show, 12 bakers meet within a tent somewhere in the UK. And over a series of weeks, they engage in a number of challenges that are structured in different ways that ask them to bake and sometimes cook to show their skills, show their creativity, and ultimately become the number one baker of that season. As one baker is eliminated each time, and different star bakers are named each week until only one person is remaining as the star baker of that season. And so as I've watched the show, I often think about writing instruction because I spent 5 years in Colorado focused on supporting teachers in their writing instruction. So it was often on my mind. And I started to see a lot of parallels between this show and about baking in general, and the way that we should think about writing instruction. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So one thing that you commonly see in the show is that contestants, every episode, there's a round where they're asked to show their skills, their basic skills in baking. It's called the technical challenge. And so that challenge in particular really asks bakers to show, do they know the fundamentals of how to bake, regardless of what they're being asked to bake, whether it's bread or pizza or cake or cookies. And I think there's a lot of parallels there with writing, that in order to be an effective writer, you have to understand the basics of the recipe, right? If you don't know how to put together a persuasive essay, if you don't know how to write a report, if you don't have the foundational recipe learned, it's going to be really hard to even begin to engage with that, right? If you've never made a cake before and someone asks you to make a cake and doesn't give you the recipe, you probably won't be able to make the cake. So I think one thing that's a takeaway for me when I think about the relationship between baking and writing is that we need to give students recipes so that they have access to the different ways that we're asking them to engage with text and the different text types that exist both in and out of school. But another reason why it's important to make this parallel is that it shows that baking is very culturally dependent as well. We bake differently depending upon where we are, depending upon where we're from, and every different places around the world, different groups of people around the world have their own ways of baking. So here's an example of a tres leches cake, which is a type of cake that's soaked in 3 different kinds of milk, hence its name. And so to bake that kind of a cake, you need to know something about the way in which Mexicans and other Latin American countries that make tres leches, the way that they have traditionally made this cake, some of the history behind it. And that's true about writing too. Depending upon the situational context or the cultural context, we might shift how we're constructing texts. So it's important to understand that writing, like baking, has cultural roots. And finally, and importantly, writing, like baking, is not simply learning a recipe. Understanding the basic components of writing a particular genre, just like the basic components of baking something, whether it's a cake or bread or muffins or cookies. Understanding that a recipe will just give us an entry point, but to really excel in the Great British Baking Show and in general as a baker, you have to bring your own creative spin to it. You have to bring yourself to the act of baking in the same way that writers bring themselves, their ideas, their unique ways of playing with language to the act of writing. And so I think there's quite a bit of parallel, as you can see, between baking and writing. And I hope you keep some of these ideas in mind as we begin to talk about a functional or genre approach to writing, which is the lens through which I teach writing and talk about writing, and the one that you'll be learning about for this week, or that you've been reading about for this week. And just to give you a bit of historical lens, now that you have this wonderful metaphor of baking percolating in your mind. So for a long time, writing instruction was taught through the direct instruction method. which was a lot of memorizing of structure, memorizing grammatical patterns. And that was believed to be essential for learning how to write, copying down sample sentences. But in the 70s, there was a big pushback against this form of writing instruction. And that's where process writing emerged, which now takes the form of writing workshop or writer's workshop. So there was this idea that students don't need this really explicit direct instruction. They just need time to write and to be creative and to revise and engage in conferencing with their teachers and their peers. And while there was a lot of good from process writing, and I think the approach that I'm sharing really builds upon the good pieces of process writing, a lot of educators and scholars were finding that multilingual learners especially were not succeeding with process writing approaches. And when I was teaching, I did a lot of process writing. I had a writer's workshop, and I also found that my multilingual learners, my emergent bilingual students, were struggling to write. And so the push that came from process writing then was this, or the move then shifted into a functional or genre approach. And this approach argues that we need to understand language from a functional perspective or from what we're using language to do, its function. And we need to be really explicit about teaching the function of language, the ways that we organize texts to students, and make sure we build plenty of that knowledge first, look at mentor text examples, co-construct text together before we engage in a process writing approach. Because first we need to teach students how to write before they actually engage in the writing process. That was the missing piece for a lot of multilingual learners, made writing really, really difficult. And this approach was developed in Australia, inspired by Michael Halliday, who you'll learn about in another video, and promoted by Jim Martin and Joan Rothery and many others in Australia. Because in Australia at that time, there were a large number of multilingual students in their schools. And so this approach developed in response to the need to serve those students. And in recent years, within the last decade or so, it's become increasingly popular in the United States as well, as a way to more effectively support multilingual learners in learning to write. Then I want to end this section with this quote from Dr. Mary Schleppergrill, who's a professor at the University of Michigan. And in her book, The Language of Schooling, she makes a clear case for why it's important to have this explicit focus on language, to engage more deeply in the function of language and not just assume that students will pick it up. She says, in the absence of an explicit focus on language, children from certain backgrounds continue to be privileged and others to be disadvantaged in learning, assessment, and promotion, perpetuating the obvious inequalities that exist today. And so she's really making the case that, some students come into our classroom already having an idea of what some of these valued types of writing are. They maybe have written them outside of the classroom as well. But many of our students, especially those from multilingual backgrounds or students from, culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds who are coming into our classrooms and encountering English for the first time, they might not have any exposure to how to put together certain types of texts that are valued at school. So she's making the case that I agree with, that by explicitly focusing on language, we can ensure that there's more of a level playing field, that all students have an access point. They're being given the recipe so that they can learn how to write. And then, of course, once they've figured out those rules, bring themselves and their ideas to the art of writing and create some of those beautiful creative cakes that we were seeing at the beginning. So with that, I'm going to conclude this session or this video. And then in the next one, we'll talk a little bit more about what a functional approach to language is and how it connects to the language of schooling.